have the pleasure of inviting our panelists to the podium.
Welcome again. This is going to be a very exciting discussion, and we have some very powerful brains in the room here to discuss a lot about where we are when it comes to climate financing in Ethiopia, but also in relation to our neighbors and the world. We'll give you a lot of opportunities to ask questions, but this is going to be a very natural dialogue. So first off, my name is Kidus Asfaw. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Kubik. Kubik is a startup that turns hard to recycle plastic waste into low carbon and low cost building materials. And we're working now to operate it here in Ethiopia. And one of the reasons I'm very excited about this conversation is we play a very big role as a private sector company into mitigating both climate change, but also how we can make communities more resilient within the country. And this discussion is really going to bring a holistic overview around how that can be done. So thank you, everyone. So a lot to discuss, so I'll go straight into it. Raj mentioned many things. I just wanted to point out 3 things that I think will be very relevant for this conversation. First one is, when it comes to climate financing in Ethiopia, we're only meeting 7% of that need. And it's only 2% of our GDP. 92% of that financing is coming from the public. The rest is private sector. 75% of Ethiopia's economy is agricultural based. So when we're talking about the shocks that climate change will be having, the reason why Ethiopia is very vulnerable has a lot to do with that as well. So with these 3 data points, we'll be crafting this conversation around 3 things. The first one is around CRGE. This is a flagship seminal policy that was set up in 2011 to really put Ethiopia in the right path when it comes to resilience and adaptation within the green economy. We'll then move more into the macro trends and really try to understand as well what are some of the regulations and policies that need to be in place, and also address how we can learn from others with similar contexts like ours in overcoming some challenges and opportunities that we have. And then finally, we'll talk about the private sector. The private sector has a very big role to play here. Regulation and policies don't matter unless there is an economy that is incentivized to actually use it. And that's going to come a lot from the private sector. So with that, I will start with Yato Zerihun, just to give us a very quick snapshot of where we are when it comes to the progress that CRGE has at the moment.
Yeah, thank you so much for this important question. So I would like to really somehow highlight the evolution of the CRGE in Ethiopia. So as we all know, it was launched, the strategy was launched in 2011, and its main objective is actually to build climate resilient green economy. And you know, in Ethiopia, in its effort to move to middle income economy, Ethiopia actually decided to take climate resilient green economy growth path. So since 2011, a number of things have happened in the country, including, for example, the establishment of a special unit within the Ministry of Finance to kind of coordinate, mobilize international climate finance, and also support, as I said earlier, the projects and the programs that are focusing on climate change mitigation and adaptation. A number of other institutions also took action in terms of establishing relevant institutional setup at various levels. So I think in terms of institutions, there are progresses. You know, institutions, when they are established, actually they take a number of things into account. You know, they are strategic instruments for government. So they're at times they merge, at times they're split, and so on and so on. But overall, there are evolutions, and one of the key evolution, I would say, is, for example, the integration of climate change into countries' Ethiopia's development plan. If you look into the second growth and transformation plan that ran from 2015 to 2018, 2020, you can see that there is a specific target in terms of, for example, emission reduction. It has never been like that before that. So that's an important step forward for the government. If you look into that document, it says by the end of the plan period, around 147 million ton of CO2 equivalent emission reduction was targeted. Then also Ethiopia ratified the Paris Agreement and also the NDC, which is nationally determined contributions. Following the adoption of the Paris Agreement, almost all countries have almost done that, but Ethiopia did it in economy-wide kind of approach. So that's important step forward. Then also we are now currently finalizing our low emission development strategy, which is a 2050 visionary strategy. So if you look also into our 10 years development plan, one of the strategic pillar, there are 10 strategic pillars of the 10 years development plan. One of the 10 is building disaster and climate resilient green economy. So there are, there are positive progresses over the years from actually the government side, and even if you look into the Green Legacy Initiative, which actually mobilized Ethiopians to do afforestation and reforestation. So there are political level, I would say the level of engagement at highest level is still, some say that, some even our own partners ask us that you guys are not really somehow paying adequate attention to your CRGE vision and so on and so forth, but I think if you look into what's happening in the country closely, there are a number of positive progress. That's what I can say. Well, there are also things that we have been doing within the Ministry of Finance. For example, we did, what have we achieved, for example, between, since the launching of the CRGE in 2011. So in collaboration with World Bank, we did CRGE implementation progress review. The report is available, you can see it. So we have, identified that we have progressed positively, and there are also challenges and rooms for improvement. So I think I stopped there. Thank you.
Oh, that's really remarkable. I do want to dive into the challenges, right? Because I think that's a really important topic. Perhaps, Dr. Zerihun, if you could just talk a little bit about what those challenges are, and then I want to pass it to Sandy to speak a little bit to what other countries are facing that might be comparable to these challenges, and how would you see Ethiopia stacking up to that?
Yeah, well, as someone who is working in the Ministry of Finance and who is also an institution that is responsible to mobilize finance from all sources and avail for implementation of countries' development plans. There are a number of challenges, particularly if we look into the global financial architecture. Well, the issue of adequacy of finance, developed countries made pledges and even commitments, let's say in Copenhagen, to mobilize 100 billion USD per year by 2020. But unfortunately, the commitment as well as the provision of finance is not really adequate. I think recently during COP26 in Glasgow, even developed countries have agreed that they haven't achieved that mobilization target. So one is the quality of the finance. The other is also the issue of access. So accessing international climate finance is very much challenging for poor countries such as Ethiopia. There are a number of barriers, not only capacity in preparing high quality project proposals, but also, the provision by itself, meeting the commitments is an issue by itself. And also, once we mobilize it, utilizing the finance is also a challenge. So we mobilize finance through projects and the programs. Once we get the finance, then delivering in time those agreed results by itself is also a challenge. And the other thing is the issue of private finance. Private sector actually, particularly when you look into, I think earlier there was a mention that adaptation is, I can say for most developing countries, the most priority is placed on adaptation and resilience building. But that sector doesn't attract private sector that much, because private sector is, as we all agree, is mostly about profit and so on. So our investments do not attract private finance that much. That's also another thing. Then also there are other issues like, issue of international politics by itself has a number of impact on climate finance access and availability. So there are a number of factors, and sometimes when we look domestically, the split, merger of institutions also creates its own impact in terms of sustainability of capacity and also institutional memory sometimes. So we have we should differentiate the issues, the challenges as domestic and also international related challenge. But it's not adequate in general, the resource available out there for developing country, the requirements to access them. If we go to not only multilateral development banks, but those institutions that are established to provide climate finance, such as Green Climate Fund, such as Global Environmental Facility, they have their own requirements. So meeting those requirements, accessing them by itself is also among the challenges, I can say.
Oh, thank you. Very insightful points. I mean, ultimately, the challenge is how do we mobilize more financing? These are going to be challenges, especially because a lot of our focus is on adaptation, which makes private sector investments less attractive. There's also institutional stability within who manages climate financing in government as well, which is really important. But you also mentioned a really important point, which is Ethiopia is not alone. Others are not meeting these targets, and there are a lot to work together on. So on that point, Sandy, if you can share some of your thoughts around what the experiences of other countries have been.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. First of all, I think the CRGE is a very important policy document for Ethiopia. It's premised on sustainable development principles. It's premised on low carbon kind of a pathway, and it's premised on building resilience. And this is the story across most of the African countries, where I'll give an example of Kenya. Kenya is currently implementing the Green Economy Strategy and Implementation Plan, which is sort of similar to the CRGE. The plan is actually premised on the sustainable development principles. But what I've seen happen in Kenya is a more of a bottom-up approach, where the government, brought together different players from different sectors, including the civil society, to sort of come up with this document and endorsed it as a policy. And then, there's been a stock take which has been done in terms of the progress, which I'm very, glad to hear that, Ethiopia has done the same. But then in terms of implementation, the document was anchored on several sectors, and several sector champions were identified across the country. For example, on the green finance space, this is led by the financial sector, where we brought together banks, insurers, and regulators of those sectors to sort of activate a program that will see, the increase of green financial flows in the country. And then, what this has led to is enabling policies, like an example of, withholding taxes on green bonds was actually withdrawn in Kenya, just to catalyze and activate the green bonds market in the country. And this has seen an inflow of, investments on a lot of the critical sectors, like the energy sector. We've had a flagship green bond being listed in Nairobi and in London that has gone towards development of affordable student accommodation. This caters for the gap that is there in the housing sector, and also caters for the social need of actually providing good accommodation for students, for them to sort of learn and engage. So in terms of tackling the challenges, we have seen a lot of programming around capacity development, just to see how we tap into the financial mechanisms for climate finance. And this is actually led by the Ministry of Finance in Kenya, the National Treasury. And we've seen a lot of programming also from organizations like FSD. We have a program with Cambridge and IID, which is ideally based on shoring up and building thought leaders on climate finance. 2 weeks ago, we trained regulators and industry players in Zambia. Very, very huge turnout, because they have realized that it is very important, over and above the public sources, that we need to activate the private sources. Yeah, and from the landscape report, Africa's NDCs assume that 75% of funding is going to come from the private sector. I think with that kind of a statistic, we need to take a step back and think, how do we activate the private sector to actually play ball in terms of, raising the capital that is required to tackle the climate shocks that we are currently experiencing. So, we are seeing an approach where the private sector is being enabled, either through policy, either through mandatory policies, or, voluntary disclosures and reporting, for them, to show and for them to demonstrate how they are actually tapping into the climate finance sources and the uses of those. And we've also seen enablers such as, reporting requirements, where, some of the financial instruments that we push for as FSD Africa, I'll give an example of the green bonds. The green bonds are very specific. It's a use of proceeds kind of an instrument that requires you to have a very well-articulated reporting mechanism that is sort of shored up with a lot of external reviews. So ideally, you have to be very accountable. If you raise money for a project through a green bond, the accountability layers are there. And those are the kind of financing streams that we want to see, the private sector tapping into to sort of complement, the public sector funding for climate and the climate adaptation and resilient priorities.
Very fascinating. At least with your example on Kenya, it's a very different approach. It is bottom up. Heard a lot of great things about what has been done so far, but what would you say have been some of the challenges, and how have you been thinking about overcoming those, at least within the Kenya context? And just to streamline my questions, after hearing from you on that, Sam, one of the things that I would be interested to hear about is African bamboo. You're in the trenches of working in Ethiopia. You are working to leverage policies like the one that CRGE is developing. What has been your experience to date? And later on, we'll go a little bit more into some of the value add that you think you can bring.
Yeah, so the biggest challenge still remains on accountability and reporting. I think, most of the African countries, for us to really attract, that quantum level of climate finance, we really have to make sure that our accountability is top notch. We are conforming to the international best practices. And also we have to make sure that, we are reporting and making some of this information publicly known. Because sometimes when you look at websites like the GCF, you see a certain country has attracted, millions of dollars in project funding. But then there's that layer of, this was a multi-country kind of a funding, yeah? So it's very difficult to sort of pin out that if Ethiopia was part of a multi-country level funding from the GCF, then how much ideally trickled into Ethiopia, and what are the kind of mechanisms which are in place to sort of see that, this was the right quantum for Ethiopia, and this is probably going to catalyze more investments into, those type of projects. So I think, we have government here in the room, and overall, government provides that oversight. So if we have a good layer of, an accountability and reporting framework, then we will start to see more and more climate finance trickling into Africa.
Super, thanks. Over to you, Sam.
Thanks, Kidus. And maybe for us, mostly it's around carbon credits and carbon financing. So most of my remarks will sort of touch on that, but maybe on a broad level, the enthusiasm around climate financing broadly is what is attracting investment into our company. And so we've spent the last 8 years doing research and development, prototyping, and ready now to turn the corner with a capital raise around $15 million to launch commercial operations. So we'll be an export facility from Ethiopia. We'll support tens of thousands of farmers and smallholders in mostly West Arsi and Sidama. We'll be exporting probably in excess of $10 million per year in revenue at scale. So we see ourselves as a fairly large player in a critical area for Ethiopia right now, which is USD generation and export. Climate financing, and specifically carbon, is a means to that end as well. So one of the things for us is, there's always investors are saying, how do you de-risk the investment? What if manufacturing doesn't go as planned? What happens if there's supply chain issues? The normal questions we get as the private sector here. One of the things is selling carbon offsets as a second revenue stream to sort of de-risk the investment. And that's really important for a lot of our potential investors. In order to do that, I really want to stress what Sandy said is around accountability and certainty, right? Because unless we can verify that carbon and verify that it's only used for our project, it's impossible to claim that as a carbon credit. So one of the things that we're really focused on now is this idea of a nested jurisdictional approach under the RED Plus framework, whereby it's certified at the local, regional, and national level. That is still under development, as I understand it. So we don't have the ability to certify our carbon, and we don't have the ability to say that this is unique to us and only used once, and then sell it, either under the voluntary or the mandatory framework. Without that, it's really difficult. And right now, what we see as a challenge on that is, for example, the World Bank and ODMIA have signed an agreement at a regional to international level, bypassing the federal level in terms of certification. And then we have the local level as well. We have to prove under the RED Plus framework that 85% or so of the value goes to the local community. Without verification mechanisms, that's impossible. We have to also verify that it's not double or triple sold. Without verification, it's impossible. We need to be able to also export it, right? So, I'll give an example of something I worked on a few years ago when doing entrepreneurship. I was working with some tech company, and they said, they were trying to export software. When tax time came, they were told, well, you didn't export correctly. Where's your DHL receipt? Where's your export receipt? They said, I uploaded it to the cloud. Someone downloaded it. And they got into a big fight with IRCA, right? Saying that you didn't export this correctly. Where's your shipping invoice? It's software. There's no shipping invoice. For us, it's carbon credits. There's no shipping invoice. Do we have the legal ability to export carbon credits? And I think that the challenge I want to stress on that is, if not, then it becomes offshored, because by force. So all of us are international companies. We can offshore this. We don't want to, but if there isn't the framework And this is sort of something that comes up over and over again, unless, when we go to IRCA and we say, look, 85% of the revenue went to local communities, we need to write that off as an expense. And if we get charged revenue for that, or profit for that, then, the business model goes away. So for us, it's really about making sure that, the systems are in place, the regulatory framework is in place that allows us to sell these carbon offsets and more generally get the, carbon finance that we need.
Thanks, Sam. You've touched on a lot of points. One of them is some of the positive track that African Bamboo and the likes of you are already doing in Ethiopia, but that, at least from what I'm hearing, there's still some ways to go around how we develop sensible approaches for you to be operating in Ethiopia and not be incentivized to take money out. We will be coming to you, Ato Frezer, just to speak a little bit around the role that the National Bank of Ethiopia is playing to incentivize companies like African Bamboo to be operating here. Also address some of the areas that he has mentioned and whether this is a trend that you see and what's being done. But before we do that, since we are going to move more into the regulatory and macro space, I do want to open it up for questions. So we'll take about 2, specifically to react to some of the points that our guests have mentioned.
Kenya's experiences in how to leverage institutional investors and development partners in Kenya's green transition. Also, there are initiatives also in carbon pricing. Blended financing are catalytic as they could ensure that public resources leverage and de-risk private financing. This could be done through provision of credit guarantees. Is Minister of Financing exploring how to implement this? These are my 2 questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And let's just take one more question to my left over there, if you don't mind standing up so that the ushers can see you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Mikael from Andalam Consulting PLC, and my question goes to Sam Rosmarin. I believe you mentioned a framework called Red Plus. Can you give a little bit of detail on that? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think the question was on Kenya's experience in leveraging institutional investors and development partners, yeah? So what I've seen happening in Kenya is, aligning government priority with the private sector's priority. And in terms of that alignment, the government has been at the forefront of ensuring that, the investment conditions in Kenya are right to sort of attract those kind of partners. And, this is very critical, especially when you look at the level of funding that this kind of partners can bring into your economies and the level of accountability that these partners can bring into your economies. So an example of leveraging development partners through the Kenya Green Economy Strategy and Implementation Plan, the Kenya Green Bonds program was forged, and this program has brought together several development partners, including UK aid through the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office of the UK. FMO is part of that partnership. IFC is part of that partnership. And the idea for bringing together these partners was, one, to enhance the capacity of the private investors in the country in terms of how they can leverage other innovative financial instruments such as green bonds to sort of fund some of their projects alongside tackling some of the climate change issues in the country. And this is what made the Econ Green Bond very successful. So Econ is a real estate development company which has done a very flagship green bond which was listed in Nairobi and listed in London. And it wouldn't have been possible if all these partners came together. And another aspect that these partners brought, there was a guarantee kind of aspect where, Garantco through the UK government, provided some guarantee, de-risking the investment, and it made it easy for them, to have an oversubscribed issuance. So that was one of the aspects. And then in terms of leveraging institutional investors, I think Africa has a lot of opportunities for a lot of the institutional investors. And if we sort of look at and align some of those opportunities with some of the challenges, then, we can really attract a big quantum of institutional capital coming into Africa. There's a lot of challenge around, I'll give an example of the most basic commodity, which is water. Yeah. And what I've seen happening in some of the work that we do, we are sort of catalyzing a pipeline of green bonds to go into the water space, looking at developing and making sure that clean and affordable water is available for all. And how we've done this is through, some of those institutional kind of relations where we present these opportunities to these investors and they come and anchor some of those issuances. So that gives us a very good aspect of, the institutional investor is coming in to de-risk. And with that kind of investment, there's an added layer of accountability, there's an added layer of reporting. So we know that, this money is ideally going to go into developing, water infrastructure, and, people are going to afford clean and safe water at a very affordable price. So, those kind of aspects, opening up the economy through innovative financial instruments has enabled us to sort of catalyze and bring on board some of those investors you've mentioned.
Thanks, Andy.
I think this issue of blending, I would say, frankly speaking, I don't know much about this one, but I know that in terms of projects and programs, but I know that the government has put in place a public-private partnership strategy in Ethiopia. The Ministry of Finance has already, that's officially, I think, endorsed as a policy by Parliament of Ethiopia. But, it is, as I said earlier, the issue of private sector engagement is a bit tricky. There are a number of factors that should be taken into account, not only the programs and projects that we are aiming to implement on the ground, but also a number of other factors that attract private sector investors, both from domestic and overseas. So we need to look into that framework when we see this. But, actually, we mobilize private sector, loans as well as a public institution, as you know. Even when we look into projects and the programs, I think World Bank mobilized around $256 million from the Green Climate Fund. Out of that, I think over 100 million was loan. So it is the Ministry of Finance that endorsed this, gave the no objection for World Bank to go ahead and mobilize loan finance from the Green Climate Fund. We are also aiming the same even for public resources. And, the issue of blending domestic resource with international, blending grant with loan is the approach we have been following, and definitely will continue to follow. But there are enabling environments, and also there are challenges as well in terms of translating those policies into actions. Yeah.
Yeah, Red Plus is a framework basically that focuses on deforestation and land degradation. So basically sets a lot of policies and regulations and standards to help, structure how that can regenerate. So for example, for us, it's around making sure that we have standards that we can follow for how forestry assets can grow, how they contribute to the carbon economy, how we can sell that carbon, et cetera. It's a fairly broad framework. We probably don't have time to go through all of it in detail, but yeah, it's really forestry related subset of what we're talking about here today. But yeah, we can talk more offline, or it's online.
Thank you. So we're going to move a bit into what does it take to create the right conditions for Ethiopia to be competitive, to attract more climate financing. And for that, Ato Frezer, I'm going to bring you into this conversation, really to start off with explaining the vision that you have within National Bank of Ethiopia to do this? What are some of the both positive and negative kind of cases that you've seen in order to achieve this vision? And finally, what special measures are taken to consider ESG investments from NBA? So I'll let you speak to this in whatever order you would like.
Okay, thank you. So if we see globally, a number of initiatives that are run globally, including the Paris Agreement to which Ethiopia is a party, and the standard issued by Basel Committee for Banking Supervision on climate change and the supervision of climate-related risks, and also other networks like network of central banks on greening of the financial system, have led a number of regulators and supervisors to get into action with regard to climate, particularly climate finance. So the trend is moving from understanding climate risk to standard setting with ultimate goal of reaching into a greening of the financial system in the respective jurisdictions. So this include on issues of climate risk management, disclosure and reporting, and also greening of the financial system. So here in Ethiopia, particularly from the National Bank perspective, the issue of climate finance has not really been part of our regular supervisory dialogue and discussion. But right now we are facing a good we are now in a good time where we need to start the journey in terms of addressing all these issues, because our financial system, the financial institutions are facing the effect of climate in their respective companies in terms of their portfolio quality, and there are also other developments that are going on. So from this angle, we really, our vision is first, we need to create the right understanding and capacity within the financial industry in terms of what climate is, climate related risks, and the need to have some sort of supervisory guidance for the financial system. So all these are the areas that we really need to work. And for that, right now we are working and partnering with development partners like the World Bank, and there is right now an active project that we are working in terms of addressing these two issues, capacity and also the need to come up with some sort of supervisory guidance for the financial system on how we can best leverage the financial industry in terms of addressing the issue of climate and environment and greening of the financial system, and also the issues on how can we incentivize businesses that are doing their business in a smart way that addresses the issue of climate and environment and the like. So there is also an interesting development. The other big development is right now the financial system is getting opened up for foreign investment. So the financial sector is there to attract foreign capital in terms of debt and in terms of equity investment, and for that the industry as a whole needs to be really very conscious on the issue of climate, how they are going to address the climate risk, and how they are going to impact, how their financing is going to impact the issue of climate. Because as you know, for a number of investors, one of the criteria that they use for allocating their capital is to what extent is these issues taken seriously, including the issue of ACG, adoption of ACG standards and the like. So in a nutshell, our vision is that we have lagged a bit, and we really need to start, and we really need to be fast in terms of creating the right capacity on this issue, and having some sort of supervisory guidance issued by the National Bank on how best the financial system gears up its effort towards this issue, and the industry as a whole needs to also work in this aspect.
Thank you. I'll pass it on to Sandy again, just to talk a little bit about what could be Kenya, since you've already started with that. When it comes to what has worked for Kenya from a regulatory perspective, can you just highlight what would suggest could be areas of capacity building within Ethiopia?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. In terms of areas of capacity development, I think when we look at climate-related risks, Kenya has a model where, we look at international best practice, and then we sort of domesticate that to the Kenyan context. And at the financial system level, the Central Bank of Kenya issued a guiding note on, climate-related risk disclosures. And this was based on a very consultative process, brought partners from the developed world looking at all the international best practices on climate-related risk disclosures for banks. And then, a policy note was issued by the central bank to sort of guide the local financial institutions in terms of that disclosure. So in terms of, capacity building, there is quite a lot of evolution when you look at the kind of climate risks that financial institutions are facing, and the kind of responses that are required. So I think the idea here is just to continuously capacity build the institutions, and in Kenya, what I've seen through the Kenya Bankers Association, we normally have a competition for the banks to see how sustainable they are. And the sustainability is looked at both operations from the internal aspects of how the banks operate, and actually the lending, on how they are lending to their customers in terms of meeting the climate targets that, probably align with the national targets, or probably our internal targets. So there's a lot of that kind of activity that is going on. And it's very interesting when you see some of those big banks that, they really take climate issues very seriously. They are investing in green buildings, and they're looking at energy efficiency. They're looking at having a pool of clients who can go into a green loan book portfolio. And it's very interesting when you see that competition, being done at that level, because it shows there's a lot of support from the top, which is the regulatory stance, and it's cascading downwards. Again, another opportunity for learning is on reporting and disclosure. Yeah. I know the ISB board is always updating on some of those requirements, and it's very critical for the financial sector, to engage those kind of bodies and see, how do we translate these kind of requirements to the local context. Yeah. And then also there's also need to continuously engage the customers, yeah, because the customers are the ones who are deploying the funds that they borrow. So if the funds are not going ideally into green projects, then all this work is not going to bear any fruit. So I find that a lot of customer engagement is also going on, where best case customers are identified and they are showcased to other customers, and it goes a long way in terms of developing a pipeline of green projects, developing a pipeline of green champions, which is aligned to the national agenda. And the advantage I've seen, especially for the work that we do at FSD Africa, when a bank wants to issue something like a green bond, there's a lot of portfolio review that is done. And the quantum of the portfolio that is green will actually determine, the appetite of the investors into putting money into that bank. So it is actually a critical time where, banks have to really look at having green portfolios, and the support has to come from institutions like the National Bank to see that, all these things are being cascaded downwards.
Thank you. And just coming back to you, Ato Frezer. So when it comes to any thinking that has happened so far in NB in incentivizing giving loans to those that have, a pro-climate agenda, is there any kind of discussion that's happening in NB right now? Or like you mentioned, are we first starting off by saying, let's really understand this landscape and let's build our capacity around it?